The courtroom was still, like the calm before a storm. The harsh fluorescent lights flickered above, casting a sterile glow on the faces of the spectators. The judge's gavel had struck just moments ago, and the silence that followed hung heavy in the air. Everyone in the room knew this day would be remembered, but no one knew just how much. Standing before the judge's podium, her hands clenched into fists, a black woman's eyes burned with a fire that only those who had tasted humiliation could understand. Her name was Maya Collins, and this was supposed to be the day of her reckoning. Instead, it had become something far worse. The officer, Sergeant Matthews, stood behind her, his breath hot against her neck as he prepared the tools. He had no idea who she was, no idea what she would become. All he knew was that today, in this courtroom, he had the power, and it was that power, that terrible, unrelenting power, that fueled his every action. With a sharp motion, he grabbed a razor, the metal gleaming under the light, and began shaving Maya's head. It wasn't just a haircut, it was a public execution of dignity. The crowd watched in silence, some flinching, others indifferent. But the moment Matthews took that first stroke of the razor, Maya felt something snap within her. Every inch of her scalp that was stripped of its hair felt like another piece of her humanity torn away. The sting of the razor was nothing compared to the sting of his touch and the contempt in his eyes. It wasn't just a shaving, it was an assault, a brutal reminder that she was nothing in this system. But Maya wasn't the kind of woman who let things slip away easily. Every second of this humiliation was branded into her memory, the sharp sound of the razor echoing in her mind like a drumbeat. She stood tall, not letting a single tear betray her, because she knew something Sergeant Matthews didn't. Today was just the beginning. As her hair fell to the floor in patches, she glanced at the faces around her. They were all watching, expecting her to break, to collapse under the weight of the injustice. But they didn't know her. What they didn't see was the spark of fury igniting deep within her, a fire that would burn down everything they held dear. In a system built on oppression, Maya was going to find her way. Through every law, every loophole, and every barrier, she would claw her way up until she stood in the very seat of power. And when she did, Sergeant Matthews would regret every moment of this. The humiliation would be repaid, not in blood, but in judgment. "You're done," Matthews sneered, standing back to admire his work. But Maya's gaze didn't waver. Her eyes locked onto his, filled with a quiet rage he couldn't even begin to understand. The courtroom had gone silent, but Maya wasn't listening to them anymore. She was listening to the sound of her own heartbeat, steady and unyielding. The shave was only the first step. She was going to make sure Matthews, and everyone who had ever looked at her like she was less than human, would never forget who she was. The razor had cut her hair, but it had also awakened something inside her, and from this moment forward, Maya Collins would be unstoppable. The storm was coming. The days that followed the courtroom debacle were a blur of humiliation and quiet suffering. Maya didn't return home to a peaceful sanctuary. There was no place left to hide. Every step she took through the streets felt like the world was watching, judging her. Whispers followed her wherever she went, the echoes of that moment still ringing in her ears. The incident in the courtroom wasn't just a personal assault. It had been broadcast, a reminder to the world of who Maya Collins was, a woman who could be broken by a single act of cruelty. She could hear their voices now, behind her back, their cruel jokes and mocking laughter, as if it was all just a game. "Did you see her? She looks like a freak now. She'll never be the same again." The words weren't just casual insults. They were the voice of a society that refused to see her as anything other than less than human. The racial slurs, the sneers, the sideways glances, all of it hit her like a sledgehammer. But it wasn't just the people on the streets. Her own community had turned away from her. It wasn't that they hated her. No, it was the quiet acceptance of the system that allowed this kind of treatment. They'd been conditioned, like everyone else, to accept their place. Her mother, too, had looked at her differently when she returned home, her eyes full of worry and sadness. "You should have just let it go, Maya," her mother had said, her voice cracking. "Don't make waves. Don't make it harder for yourself." But Maya couldn't accept that. Her pride, her very sense of self, had been stripped away in that courtroom. She had become the symbol of a system that crushed people like her, leaving nothing but broken bodies and bruised souls behind. She couldn't let it stand, not when there was still breath in her lungs. Each day, she faced a new battle. At the job she was barely holding on to, the stares from her co-workers felt like daggers, their eyes always lingering just a little too long, too judgmental. The subtle racial prejudice was always there, hovering just beneath the surface. She wasn't just the token black woman in the office. Now, she was the woman who had been humiliated, the one who had been reduced to an object of ridicule. The whispers were always there, the unspoken belief that she had no place in a system that wasn't built for her. But she fought back. In her quiet moments, she could almost hear her mother's words in her mind, but they only fueled her resolve. Maya knew that her suffering wasn't just an individual struggle, it was a reflection of something far deeper, something that had been built into the very bones of society. She wasn't just fighting for herself, she was fighting for every person who had ever been trampled on, ignored, or abused by the system. She was fighting to be seen. One day, as she walked through the crowded streets of the city, she overheard a conversation between two men. Their voices were low, but their words sliced through the air like a blade. "Did you hear about the black woman? The one in the courthouse? They shaved her head. I heard she was trying to make a big deal about it, but who's going to listen to her? She's just some angry black girl." One of the men laughed, as though the very idea of her having dignity was a joke. Maya stopped in her tracks, her pulse quickening. The words hit her harder than anything Matthews had done in the courtroom. It wasn't the shaved head that hurt. It was the dismissive, casual cruelty in their tone. They didn't even see her as a person. Her hands balled into fists, nails biting into her palms. Her body trembled with rage, but she swallowed it down. She couldn't afford to break. She couldn't afford to let them see how much it hurt. Not yet. She kept walking, but the fire inside her burned hotter. The world might have seen her as a victim, but Maya was done being that. She wasn't going to stay the broken woman they expected her to be. She would fight, and she would win. In the weeks that followed, Maya began her quiet rebellion. She dove into studying the law, poring over legal textbooks late into the night. The more she learned, the clearer her path became. She wasn't going to let herself remain a pawn in a game she didn't choose. Every day, she stepped into that world with one thought in mind: I will make them regret underestimating me. The system that had stripped her of her dignity would become her battleground. The world that had laughed at her would soon be forced to reckon with the woman she was becoming. She would no longer be just a face in the crowd. She would rise above them all. And when she finally sat in that seat of power, looking down on the very people who had laughed at her, who had tried to break her, she would show them who the real victim was. The chains were still there, but she was learning how to break them, piece by piece. Let's take a brief pause here. We'd love to hear from you. Where are you listening to our story from? Have you ever experienced something similar in your life? Feel free to share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to stay tuned for the rest of the journey. Now, let's continue. The days after the courtroom incident blurred together, a constant cycle of humiliation and the bitter taste of anger. Maya felt like a ghost, walking through the motions of life, but never truly living. The harsh stares, the muttered insults, the whispers, they were everywhere. But it wasn't just the world around her that had changed. She had changed. The woman who had once been soft, polite, and passive was now someone different. She could feel it in her bones. Every step she took, she felt the weight of the system pressing down on her, a system built on oppression, racism, and injustice. The invisible walls that surrounded her were growing higher, but so was the fire inside her. The first time Maya truly felt the extent of the damage wasn't in the streets or at the courthouse. It was in the workplace. She had always known that being black in a predominantly white office was a challenge, but it had never felt so suffocating until now. After the incident, the quiet looks, the murmured conversations, and the pointed silences grew unbearable. The men in her office, the ones who had once smiled at her, said hello, treated her like a colleague, now avoided eye contact, and she could see the judgment in their eyes. "You know, she's one of those people who makes everything a race issue," one of the office workers said, his voice just loud enough for her to hear as he stood in the break room with another colleague. Maya froze, her heart pounding in her chest. The casual cruelty in his tone made her sick. It wasn't just the words. It was the way they saw her, the way they thought of her as something less than them. She had no doubt that they were talking about her. It was impossible to ignore the fact that she was the target of their derision. The black woman who had made a spectacle of herself in court, who had been publicly humiliated, who had been shaved like an animal. That's how they saw her. To them, her life was just another distraction, another uncomfortable reminder of a world they wanted to forget. "Don't be too hard on her," the second man replied, his voice laced with condescension. "She's probably just upset because she's one of those who always thinks she's a victim. She has to learn to move on." Move on. Maya wanted to scream. How could they not understand? How could they not see the deep wound that had been opened in her soul? It wasn't about moving on. It wasn't about forgetting the humiliation. It was about surviving in a world that had no place for her. She turned away, her hands shaking as she grabbed her coffee cup. But the words stayed with her. They gnawed at her, eating away at her sense of self-worth. She wasn't just a victim of one man's cruelty in the courtroom. She was a victim of a system that had never valued her. A system that had always put up walls around her, invisible, yet unyielding. Maya spent the next few weeks moving through life like a machine. She woke up, went to work, went home, and did it all again the next day. But with each passing moment, she felt the chains tightening around her, pulling her deeper into the darkness. She was drowning in a sea of despair, her mind consumed with thoughts of vengeance. There was no other option now. She had to find a way to break free. Her only solace came when she buried herself in her studies. Law books became her escape, the dense pages filled with a language that promised power. Maya knew she needed to get out of this office, out of this life. The more she read, the more she realized that the very system that had kept her in chains could also be used to set her free. If she wanted to break through the walls, she would have to do it from the inside. She would have to play the game better than anyone ever had. But that didn't mean she could forget the pain. The pain was always there, lurking beneath the surface, ready to rise up and consume her. It wasn't just the daily microaggressions, the sideways glances, or the whispers in the hallways. It was the constant reminder that she was never fully human in their eyes. They saw her as less than them, not just because of her race, but because of everything that came with it. To them, she was a symbol of everything they hated: anger, resentment, and the fight for something more. They were content in their privilege, in the belief that the world was theirs to control, to shape. Maya knew she had to change. She had to show them who she was. Not just some angry black woman, but a force they would never see coming. The first step was to confront the people who had hurt her the most, her co-workers. One evening, after another long day at the office, Maya made her decision. She wasn't going to let them continue to treat her like she didn't belong. She wasn't going to be their invisible black woman anymore. She walked into the break room where the two men were talking, their voices low but still laced with mockery. They stopped talking as soon as she entered, and for a moment, the silence was deafening. Maya took a deep breath, then spoke. "I heard you talking about me," she said, her voice steady but cutting. "You think I'm just some victim, don't you?" The men exchanged uncomfortable glances, but neither of them spoke. "Let me tell you something," Maya continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I'm not a victim. I'm not some charity case you can pity. I'm not here for your approval or your sympathy. You think you've got it all figured out, that you can just laugh at me, humiliate me, and I'll go away quietly. But I won't. She took a step closer to them, her eyes unwavering. I'm going to take everything you think you've built, your privilege, your comfort, and I'm going to tear it down. You think I'm angry? You haven't seen anything yet. The men didn't respond, but she could see it in their eyes. They were afraid. They were starting to understand who she was. Maya was no longer the woman they could dismiss. She was no longer invisible. She turned and walked out, leaving them standing there in stunned silence. But this was just the beginning. There was still so much to do. Maya knew that she had to get out of the office, out of this environment where she would always be trapped. She had to rise above it, but it wouldn't be easy. She would have to fight to prove that she wasn't just some woman who had been humiliated. She was a woman who was going to change everything, and she would make them regret every second they'd spent underestimating her. Maya was done with being invisible. It was time for the world to see who she really was. Maya's life was beginning to take shape in a way she had never anticipated. Her mind had become a battlefield, a place where every thought, every feeling, every injustice was calculated and processed with the precision of someone who knew that her survival depended on the sharpness of her intellect. But the path she had chosen was not an easy one. The cost of ambition was high, and for Maya, it felt as though the price would never stop rising. She threw herself into her studies, devouring legal texts with an insatiable hunger. The hours of research became her refuge, her escape from the painful reality of the world she had been forced to live in. Every paragraph of law, every clause in the books offered a promise: power. The system that had made her a victim could, with time and knowledge, become the tool of her redemption. But it was a long, exhausting road, one that would demand everything from her. But Maya knew this was her only way forward. The courtroom had already stripped her of her dignity. Her former colleagues had mocked her in ways she could not forget. There was only one way to gain back her respect, not through submission, not by quietly accepting the cards she had been dealt, but through power. She would rise through the system, infiltrating the very system that had sought to destroy her. She would become what no one thought she could: a judge. The first real test of her resolve came when she faced a decision. Should she stay in the office where she had been treated with contempt and barely tolerated, or should she leave and pursue her true calling? Maya could already see the whispers, the scornful glances, and the cold treatment she received. It was no longer just a matter of making money to survive. She was at a crossroads, and deep down, she knew she had to choose to fight. The decision was made. She quit her job. Her departure didn't go unnoticed. The office buzzed with curiosity, and there were more than a few snide remarks that reached her ears before she left for the last time. "Guess she's finally realizing she's not cut out for this," one of the secretaries whispered, just loud enough for Maya to hear. That remark stung, but it also fueled her determination. She wasn't just quitting to run away from her problems. She was quitting to pursue something bigger. This was her chance to prove them all wrong. She wasn't the angry black woman they had painted her to be. She was going to rise to heights they could never reach. At first, the transition was difficult. Maya found herself in a series of lower-paying jobs, doing menial tasks at various legal firms. Her credentials, though impressive in theory, meant little to the world. In the eyes of most employers, Maya was just another minority looking to break into a field that didn't want her there. Time and time again, she was rejected, not because she lacked ability, but because of her race. The barriers were insidious, so well hidden that even the most educated among her peers didn't see them. A woman of color in a male-dominated, predominantly white legal world was always going to be at a disadvantage. It wasn't just the racism she encountered directly. It was the more subtle, insidious forms of discrimination, the dismissive tones of colleagues who spoke to her as though she were invisible, the unsolicited advice from older attorneys who were quick to tell her what she couldn't do, the slow, suffocating realization that the glass ceiling was more than just a metaphor. It was real, and it was unbreakable, unless you fought with every ounce of your being. But fight she did. Maya worked tirelessly, taking on cases no one else wanted. She spent nights preparing arguments that would never see the light of day. She stood in courtrooms, watching the seasoned attorneys effortlessly win cases that she knew, deep down, could have been hers if only the system had been fair. But fairness was not something she had ever known. She had never been afforded the luxury of equality. And so, she worked harder. Her persistence paid off. Slowly but surely, she began to build a reputation. Her tenacity in the face of constant adversity earned her the respect of a few. They weren't the powerful men and women who made the rules, but they were the ones who mattered in the beginning. The ones who recognized talent when it was wrapped in a package that society was too blind to appreciate. But with every step forward, there was another step backward. The deeper Maya delved into the legal world, the more she realized how deeply embedded the system was in racism. She was one of the only black women in the entire firm, and she constantly felt like an outsider. Her colleagues didn't outright insult her. They were much more subtle than that. The microaggressions were constant. The exaggerated compliments, the refusal to give her credit where it was due, the way they only sought her opinion when they wanted to prove their own open-mindedness. Maya became intimately familiar with the term othered. It was a part of her existence now, an invisible scar that marked her as different. She had become so used to these small indignities that at times she almost didn't notice them anymore. But when one of the senior partners, Charles Harding, called her into his office to discuss a case she had been working on, she could feel the tension in the air. Harding was one of those men who saw himself as above it all, the kind of man who believed that his position in society was a reflection of his superior intellect and work ethic, the kind of man who thought that racism didn't exist because he treated everyone equally. "I've been looking at your case file," Harding began, his voice smooth but condescending. "It's good. But I'm not sure it's the kind of case that's going to make you stand out. You know, being a black woman in this industry, you've got to do more than just be competent. You've got to prove yourself to everyone. You've got to show that you belong here." Maya's stomach tightened at his words, but she kept her face neutral. This was what they expected of her, that she would be thankful for the crumbs they offered, grateful for the chance to prove herself in a world that was never meant for her. She fought the urge to snap. Instead, she smiled politely. "Thank you, Mr. Harding. I'll make sure to step up." That night, as she sat at her desk, Maya's thoughts swirled. They didn't see her as a person. To them, she was just an object to be tolerated, a token to show that the system wasn't completely broken. She wasn't allowed to have flaws, mistakes, or doubts. She had to be perfect, not just because it was required of everyone, but because of the color of her skin. It was in these moments, when the weight of the world felt unbearable, that Maya realized how deep the system's cruelty ran. She wasn't just fighting for success, she was fighting for survival. And survival meant doing what no one else could. She would not just climb the ladder, she would tear it down. Her mind became an engine of vengeance and ambition. The world had written her off as a statistic, as one of the many that would never succeed in their twisted game. But she was determined to prove them wrong. It was no longer about proving she belonged. It was about dismantling the system that had never been built for her in the first place. Maya was beginning to understand something profound. To break the chains, you first had to embrace the darkness. She had to embrace everything the world thought she couldn't be, and then rise from it, stronger, smarter, and more ruthless than ever before. The road ahead would be long, and it would be full of more obstacles, more microaggressions, more people who would try to tear her down. But none of that mattered. Maya Collins was on her way to becoming something they never saw coming. And when she finally took her place in the seat of power, they would all remember the woman they tried to erase. Maya's world had become a series of moments where she could either sink or rise. Every day, every action, every interaction was another battle in a war she could not afford to lose. As the years passed, she found herself digging deeper into the darkness of the legal world, a world where no one was kind to her, and the echoes of racism were always present, like a persistent hum in the background. But the system didn't just try to break her spirit. It forced her to confront the parts of herself she'd been trying to suppress. Her success was no longer measured by how well she performed or how much she learned. It was measured by how much she could endure without breaking. Every glance, every condescending word, every tiny slight. These were the things that shaped her now. She had long since learned to smile through them, to nod politely, to endure with quiet rage. But inside, the fire burned hotter. Maya knew that to survive, to make them truly see her, she had to become something more. At first, her perseverance seemed like a victory. After a few years of hard work, she had managed to climb higher in the firm. She had earned the respect of some of her colleagues, but the reality of her place was impossible to ignore. She had fought for her position, bled for it, but still, no matter how much she achieved, there was always someone above her, someone who saw her as nothing more than a token. Maya was good. In fact, she was better than most. But her race was always the thing that would hold her back, the invisible barrier that would never allow her to go as high as the others. It wasn't the lack of talent. It wasn't her lack of skill or intelligence. It was her skin. And that was something she couldn't change. Let's be honest, Richard Carter, one of the senior partners, said one day as he and Maya walked out of a meeting. "You've made a name for yourself here, Maya, but you can't expect to get the same opportunities as the others. You're lucky to even be here." His words hung in the air, thick with condescension. He said it with a smile, as if he were offering her a compliment, but Maya knew better. He wasn't complimenting her. He was reminding her of her place. He wasn't saying she wasn't good enough. He was saying she would never be good enough. The rules of the game were rigged, and she was never going to win. That was the first time she truly understood. They wanted her to stay in her lane, to be thankful for the scraps they tossed her way, to know her place. But the more they said it, the more they showed it, the more Maya realized how deeply ingrained the system was. It wasn't just about her skills. It was about who she was. A woman of color, trying to make her mark in a world that had always seen her as an outsider. That day, after the conversation with Carter, Maya went home, seething with frustration. She had worked tirelessly, pouring herself into her cases, outworking everyone else. But still, it was never enough. She had been forced to prove herself every step of the way. She had been made to feel that no matter how hard she tried, no matter how much she accomplished, she would always be the other. But now, the rage inside her had transformed. It wasn't just frustration anymore. It was a cold, calculated anger, one that burned with the desire to dismantle everything. Maya wasn't going to fight for a place at the table anymore. She was going to build her own table, and she was going to make sure the people who had tried to suppress her never had a seat at it again. She spent weeks contemplating her options, her path forward. The dream of becoming a judge, once an impossible fantasy, was now the only thing that kept her moving forward. But getting there would require more than just intelligence and hard work. It would require her to outsmart the system at its own game. The path to a judicial appointment was a treacherous one, filled with hidden prejudices, backroom deals, and unspoken biases. Maya had heard the stories from other attorneys, how the game was rigged, how the people who were truly capable were often pushed aside in favor of those who played by the unspoken rules. She had seen it firsthand, how the more powerful and connected individuals were always given the positions, while people like her were left on the fringes, forced to fight for scraps. But Maya wasn't going to let that happen. She would use everything she had learned, every ounce of her experience and knowledge, to rise above them. She had made a name for herself in the firm, and now it was time to take the next step. She had set her sights on a judgeship, and nothing would stop her from claiming it. It was time to show them who she really was. But as Maya began her campaign for the judgeship, the true ugliness of the world she was trying to break into became impossible to ignore. The whispers, the slights, the judgment, they were everywhere. No matter how much she accomplished, there were always those who saw her as less, who saw her race as an insurmountable obstacle. One day, At a fundraiser for a prominent judicial candidate, Maya overheard a conversation that sent a chill down her spine. "I heard they're thinking about appointing that Collins woman to a judgeship," one man said, his voice tinged with disdain. "I don't know what they're thinking. We need people who understand the law, not her." "I agree," another voice chimed in. "The whole thing's a mess. She's black, she's a woman, and she's trying to climb the ranks like she belongs here. The system wasn't built for her, and it's a shame we're pretending it's okay." Maya could barely contain her fury as she stood just a few feet away, hidden in the crowd. She had worked her entire life to get to this point, to prove that she was more than capable. And yet, here they were, dismissing her, dehumanizing her, reducing everything she had achieved to nothing more than her race and gender. They didn't see her as a brilliant lawyer. They didn't see her as someone who had earned her place. They saw only what they wanted to see, the black woman trying to break into a world that had never welcomed her. As she listened to their words, Maya realized that the battle she was facing wasn't just against the system. It wasn't just against the partners at the firm or the people who told her she didn't belong. It was against a society that had been built on the idea that some people were just born to lead and others were born to follow. But Maya had no intention of following. She walked out of the fundraiser that night with a new resolve. She had heard their voices. She had felt their judgment. But she would never let it define her. She would not be the victim they expected her to be. She would be the one they would never see coming. Maya knew what she had to do now. She wasn't just going to sit back and play by the rules. She was going to rewrite them. And as she began her campaign for a seat on the bench, she realized that the very people who had tried to crush her would become the ones who would regret ever underestimating her. The system was broken, but she wasn't going to fix it. She was going to burn it down and rebuild something far stronger in its place. The road ahead was uncertain, and the obstacles would be immense. But Maya was more determined than ever. She had faced the darkest corners of the legal world, and now she was ready to face the truth. Her fight had only just begun, and she was going to win. The system would never know what hit it. Maya Collins had always known that the road to power would be paved with struggle, but nothing could have prepared her for the suffocating weight of the politics, prejudice, and power plays that came with it. As she began her campaign for a judgeship, the game was no longer about legal battles and courtroom victories. This was something darker. It was about positioning, manipulation, and above all, survival in a world that had never been built for people like her. The first blow came when she was invited to a meeting with several influential figures in the local legal community, including prominent judges, attorneys, and politicians. It was clear from the outset that this was not going to be a fair discussion. This was not about qualifications. This was about their power, and Maya was simply the latest pawn in a game where the rules were rigged against her. As she entered the lavishly decorated conference room, Maya could feel the eyes of every person in the room on her. The air was thick with condescension, and the smiles on the faces of the men who sat around the table were anything but welcoming. They greeted her with polite nods, but the undertones of their words were impossible to ignore. It was as if she had walked into a den of predators, and they were deciding whether or not she was worthy of being devoured. "Maya," began Judge Hamilton, a man who had long been a fixture in the legal community, his voice smooth and practiced. "We've been following your career with interest. You've certainly made quite a name for yourself, but I have to ask, why do you think you're ready for this kind of responsibility? This isn't a job for someone who's just trying to prove a point." His words hung in the air like a taunt, a thinly veiled suggestion that she wasn't quite worthy of such an important position. It wasn't a question about her ability. It was a question about her place in the world. Maya could feel it. He was questioning her right to even think she could be on the bench, and he wasn't the only one. Across the table, another man, a powerful political figure named Tom Cartwright, looked at her with an air of amusement. "You've been through a lot to get here, Maya. But, as Hamilton said, this isn't just about being smart or ambitious. This is about being the kind of person who can lead with wisdom and authority. It's about knowing your place." He emphasized the last words, as if making sure she understood that the place they were referring to was not a seat at the table, but rather the position of someone who knew their limits. Maya's chest tightened. The subtle, yet undeniable racism was impossible to ignore. They weren't talking about her qualifications, her legal expertise, or the fact that she had worked tirelessly to get to this point. They were questioning her very existence in this space. They saw her skin color before they saw her accomplishments, and they made no attempt to hide it. But Maya wasn't going to let them see her fear. She kept her voice steady and calm, even though the anger was bubbling beneath the surface. I've spent years proving myself, not just in the courtroom, but in a system that was designed to hold people like me back. I know my place, and I know what I bring to the table. You don't have to accept me, but you will respect me. Judge Hamilton's lips twisted into a thin smile, and there was a moment of silence in the room. It was a warning. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially by someone who didn't know their place. And yet Maya could see the subtle shift in the room. The men were now paying attention, if only out of a desire to see how far she would push. But the meeting didn't end there. As they discussed the finer details of the potential appointment, it became clear that Maya wasn't just fighting for a seat in the courtroom. She was fighting for her very dignity, for the right to exist in a space that was never meant for her. Every word, every glance, every passing comment was a reminder of how far she had yet to go. "We have to consider the public perception," Cartwright said, his voice dripping with condescension. "You have to understand, Maya, that the voters won't look at your record. They won't care about the cases you've won or the hours you've put in. They'll care about your image. And right now it's not ideal." The subtle jab at her image stung more than anything else he had said. It wasn't just about her qualifications or her potential. It was about her race. They saw her as a novelty, a political symbol, not a serious contender for the position. If they couldn't pigeonhole her into the mold they had created, they would do everything they could to ensure she was never given a real chance. "I understand the importance of public perception," Maya said, keeping her tone measured. "But I would argue that the system needs change. It's time to stop worrying about image and start worrying about true justice." Her words hung in the air, and for a moment there was an uneasy silence. She had made her point, but in their eyes it was clear that she was still the outsider, the woman who didn't belong. When the meeting ended, Maya left the room with her head held high, but the weight of their words settled on her like a lead blanket. The feeling of humiliation, the quiet racism they had cloaked in politeness, followed her down the hall. They weren't interested in her talent. They weren't interested in her abilities. They were interested in keeping their world intact. And that world didn't have space for people like her. But Maya had never been the type to back down. The ugliness she had experienced in that meeting only reinforced her resolve. She wasn't going to let them break her. She was going to fight harder, push further, and prove them all wrong. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about dismantling a system that had been built to exclude people like her. As Maya began to campaign more aggressively, the attacks grew more personal. Her opponents, both in the legal community and the political sphere, began to target her character, questioning her qualifications, her commitment, and even her morals. They couldn't attack her on her legal record. She was too accomplished for that. So they resorted to undermining her character, painting her as an angry, radical figure who was too emotional to be trusted with the power of the judiciary. One day, she received a call from an old acquaintance, a well-placed attorney who had been following the campaign. "Maya," he said, his voice low, "they're spreading rumors. They're calling you unhinged, saying you're too aggressive for a judgeship. They're trying to paint you as the kind of person who would ruin everything the system stands for." Maya clenched her jaw. It wasn't just that they were attacking her. It was that they were using her very strength against her, twisting it into something dangerous. The system had always feared strong, capable women of color, and now it was trying to crush her under the weight of its prejudice. "They won't stop until they've destroyed me," Maya said, her voice steady despite the rage coursing through her. "But I won't stop either. I'm going to make them regret every single word. The attacks didn't just stop with rumors. They began to escalate. Her opponents, unable to find anything substantial to discredit her, started digging into her past, looking for anything they could use to tear her down. They found nothing. No scandals. No misdeeds. So, they resorted to the most effective weapon they had, the silent prejudice that ran through every vein of society. The whispers grew louder. The backroom deals grew darker. Maya was no longer just a candidate for a judgeship. She was a symbol of everything they feared. A black woman in power. A woman who refused to stay in her place. As the election loomed closer, Maya's resolve grew stronger. She had been through worse. She had faced humiliation in the courtroom, rejection in the legal world, and prejudice at every turn. And she had come out on top. This fight was no different. She wasn't going to back down now. The world didn't want her in the courtroom. She would make them need her. She would make them beg for her to sit at the table. And when she did, when she finally stepped into that judge's seat, the world would see exactly what they had underestimated. Maya Collins was coming for them all, and nothing was going to stop her. The weeks leading up to the election felt like an eternity. Maya had been through more than anyone should have to endure in a single lifetime. The whispered insults, the carefully orchestrated campaigns to discredit her, the endless belittling of her accomplishments. Every moment she spent fighting for her rightful place in the judicial system had been a battle, and now, as the final stretch of her campaign loomed, it felt as though the world was closing in on her. But for Maya, quitting was never an option. The fire inside her had only grown stronger with each obstacle, each slight, each moment of humiliation. She knew that the fight wasn't just about winning the judgeship. It was about something much larger. It was about challenging the very system that had been designed to oppress and subjugate people like her. This wasn't just her battle anymore. It was the battle of every person who had been told they didn't belong. As the campaign moved into its final phase, Maya's opponents began to increase their efforts to tear her down. The attacks were no longer subtle. They were loud, aggressive, and relentless. They knew they couldn't compete with her on merit. She had earned every accolade, every victory. So instead, they resorted to tactics designed to destroy her reputation, using everything they had to paint her as an unstable, radical figure. The whispers about her aggressive demeanor, her uncontrolled temper, and her unfit nature echoed through every corner of the legal community. It was a calculated effort to dehumanize her, to turn her into the angry black woman stereotype that the world had so often used to invalidate people like her. They used the very traits that had made her successful against her strength, her conviction, and her relentless pursuit of justice. It wasn't enough that she had fought her way through every obstacle the system threw her way. Now she was being punished for it. The more she proved herself, the more they pushed back. Maya had never been naive enough to think her journey would be easy, but the brutality of this fight was unlike anything she had ever imagined. One morning, as she sat in her office looking over the latest reports from her campaign, a familiar name popped up in the headline of a local news outlet. Maya Collins. "Is she too angry for a judgeship?" the headline screamed. Beneath it, the article played out the narrative she had been dreading. One of instability, of uncontrollable rage, and of a woman who simply couldn't fit into the system that had always defined who was worthy of power. The article quoted a local lawyer, one who had been a vocal critic of Maya's campaign, saying, "Maya Collins has made her entire campaign about personal attacks. She's angry, and that's a problem when it comes to a position of power. A judge must be impartial. She is clearly too emotionally invested to handle the responsibilities of the bench." It was nothing new. It was the same tired rhetoric, the same playbook that had been used for generations to silence people of color and women. And yet, it cut deeper than anything she had faced before. The idea that she was too angry to be a judge wasn't a critique of her qualifications or her integrity. It was an attempt to strip her of her humanity, to make her seem like an emotional, unstable woman who was incapable of thinking rationally. It was a direct attack on the very essence of who she was. A powerful, unapologetic woman who had fought for every inch of space she now occupied. But Maya wasn't going to let it stop her. She couldn't. Not now. Not after everything she had been through. As she sat there, staring at the article, her phone rang. It was her campaign manager, Mark. "Maya, you need to be careful," he said, his voice tinged with concern. "This article, it's everywhere. We're getting calls from donors, from influential figures, and they're all asking the same question. Is Maya Collins too angry for this?" Maya felt the anger rise in her chest again, but she forced it down. "I don't care what they're saying. They're using the same tired tactics they've always used. They're trying to discredit me because they know I'm a threat. They're scared." "I know," Mark replied, "but this could cost us. We need to address it, publicly." "I'll address it on my terms," Maya said firmly. "I'm not going to apologize for my anger. I've earned it, and if they can't handle it, then they don't deserve to sit in judgment of anyone." The conversation ended, but the weight of what Mark had said lingered. The truth was, Maya had never been given the luxury of making mistakes. Every move she made was scrutinized, every word she spoke twisted into something that could be used against her. It was exhausting, but it was also her reality, and she knew that if she was going to win this, she had to play by her own rules. Her next move was clear. She was going to address the accusations head on, but she was going to do it in a way that forced them to see her for who she really was. A woman who had fought every step of the way and who would not be silenced by their attempts to define her. The next day, Maya held a press conference, a rare and bold move for a candidate at this stage of the campaign. She walked up to the podium, her posture straight, her eyes locked on the camera. For the first time, she wasn't just answering questions, she was taking control. "Let's get one thing straight," Maya began, her voice calm but firm. "I am angry. I have every right to be. For years, I've had to fight, not just for my career, but for my humanity. I've had to fight against a system that was designed to hold people like me back. A system that values image over substance. A system that punishes people for speaking up, for challenging the status quo." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle in the room. The cameras were on her, the reporters leaning in, and for the first time in the campaign she felt a rush of power. They were listening. "I've been called angry. I've been called unfit. I've been told I don't belong. And you know what? I'm proud of that anger, because that anger is what's kept me going. That anger is what has allowed me to stand here today. It's what has fueled every victory, every step I've taken to get closer to this moment. And if they can't handle that, then they're not ready for real change. They're not ready for a judge who isn't afraid to speak the truth." The room was silent for a long moment. Maya could feel the weight of their judgment, but she didn't care. She had said what needed to be said. She had let the world know that she wasn't going to back down. But as the days passed, the backlash was immediate and overwhelming. Her opponents seized on her words, twisting them to fit their narrative. They painted her as an emotional, unstable figure who lacked the temperament for the job. They claimed that her anger was a sign of weakness, not strength. Maya knew that these were just the same old tactics they had used for generations to silence people of color and women. They were scared that a woman like her could break through the system, tear it down, and build something new. They were scared of the change she represented. But Maya didn't let their fear dictate her path. The attacks only fueled her resolve. She began to double down on her message, using every platform available to her to speak out against the very system that had tried to suppress her. She wasn't just campaigning for a judgeship anymore. She was campaigning for a revolution. Her words resonated with people, especially those who had been silenced for too long. Women, people of color, and marginalized communities saw in her a reflection of their own struggles. Maya was no longer just a candidate. She had become a symbol of resistance. The final days of the campaign were a blur of rallies, interviews, and speeches. Maya knew the battle wasn't over, but she had already won something far more important than a seat on the bench. She had won the fight for her own dignity. She had reclaimed her voice, and that alone was a victory. When the results of the election were finally announced, Maya didn't win. But she didn't lose either. Because in the end, the system had underestimated her, and they would never forget the woman who had stood up to them, who had refused to let them define her. Maya Collins had changed the game, and the game would never be the same again. The weeks after the election felt like a cruel twist of fate. Maya Collins had come so close to securing a position on the bench, a victory that would have proven to the world that the system could be broken, reshaped, and rebuilt into something that served everyone, not just the powerful few. But the results were not in her favor. Despite her fierce campaigning, despite the years of work, despite the struggles she had endured, the system she had spent her entire career trying to reform had turned its back on her. Yet, as she sat in the quiet solitude of her office, staring at the wall and reflecting on the outcome, she didn't feel defeat. She felt something much more dangerous, something that would shape the coming days, months, and years of her life. Rage. They had done everything in their power to destroy her. They had branded her as an angry black woman, an uncontrollable force who was unfit to serve in a position of power. They had used the same tired rhetoric, the same deep-seated prejudice that had been used to hold people like her back for centuries. But in the end, Maya had refused to play by their rules, and for that, they had punished her. But they didn't know her. They didn't know the depths of her resolve. They hadn't broken her, not even close. They had only fueled the fire inside her, the fire that had started in that courtroom when she had been humiliated by a man who had thought he could erase her. That fire had burned brightly throughout the campaign, and now it burned even hotter. She wasn't done, not by a long shot. Maya spent the next few days in a fog of contemplation, trying to decide what her next move would be. She had lost the battle for the judgeship, but that didn't mean the war was over. The system that had crushed her, the system that had tried to silence her, was still out there. And it was still just as broken as it had ever been. But she had learned something valuable from this experience. She had learned how deeply entrenched the biases and prejudices were, how much resistance there was to true change. She had fought for the seat on the bench, but now she realized that the real power wasn't in the judge's seat. The real power was in the ability to change the system itself. Maya wasn't going to accept their verdict. She wasn't going to be just another statistic, another name in the history books of failed attempts. Instead, she would find another way. She would find another path to power, one that didn't require her to play by the rules they had set. And she would do it on her own terms. As she sat at her desk, making plans for the future, Maya received an unexpected call. It was from an old mentor, someone who had always believed in her, a woman named Laura, a former judge who had retired after decades of service. Laura had seen the potential in Maya long before anyone else had, and she had become one of the few people Maya trusted without question. "I saw the election results, Maya," Laura said, her voice kind and understanding. "I know this isn't easy, but I need you to listen to me. You've been fighting to get into their world, to be accepted into a system that has never been open to you. But I think it's time you stop trying to fit into their world. It's time you start creating your own." Maya's mind began to race. "What do you mean?" "I've been watching you, Maya. You've already done something that most people would never have the courage to do. You've exposed the cracks in the system, and now it's time for you to break it wide open. There's a whole movement out there, waiting for someone like you to lead it. You don't need their approval. You don't need their seat on the bench. What you need is a platform, a cause that will unite the people who've been silenced for too long." Maya felt a rush of realization. For the first time, it wasn't about fighting for a seat at the table. It was about creating her own table. It was about empowering those who had been left behind, the people who had been silenced by the system, to rise up and demand the change that had so long been denied to them. "I'm listening," Maya said, her voice steady with determination. Laura's voice was firm, full of purpose. "Start your own movement, Maya. Build your own coalition. The system can't ignore a movement of people who are united, who know their worth, and who are ready to fight. But you have to be the one to lead them." Maya was silent for a moment, letting the weight of Laura's words sink in. She had spent so much time trying to fight within the system that she had never considered the possibility of breaking it down completely. But now, the vision was clear. She didn't need to be a judge. She didn't need to play by their rules. She could change the entire system from the ground up, and she could do it by building a coalition of people who had been left out for far too long. The decision was made. Maya was done trying to prove herself to a system that had never intended to let her in. She would build something new, something powerful, and something that would force the world to reckon with the change that was coming. Her first step was to gather her supporters. She reached out to grassroots organizations, activists, and legal reform groups. She started speaking at rallies, at protests, at town halls. Everywhere she went, she told the same story. The story of how the system had tried to break her, tried to silence her, tried to make her feel like she didn't belong. But Maya wasn't the only one. There were millions of people just like her, people who had been excluded, people who had been denied the same opportunities, people who had been told they didn't matter. Slowly but surely, the movement began to grow. Maya's name became synonymous with change, with resistance, with the unrelenting fight for justice. She wasn't just a candidate anymore. She was the leader of a movement that was focused on dismantling the barriers that had kept so many people trapped in a system that wasn't designed for them. But as the movement grew, so did the resistance. The people who had once dismissed her as a mere candidate now saw her as a threat. The media, which had once been eager to report on her failures, now found itself scrambling to find new ways to discredit her. The same old tactics, the racial slurs, the dismissive comments, the subtle attempts to paint her as unfit, were used against her with renewed vigor. At one point, a news anchor referred to her as a radical, a dangerous force who was trying to destroy the very fabric of the nation. The insinuation was clear. She wasn't just challenging the system, she was threatening the power of those who held it. But Maya didn't flinch. She had seen worse. She had been called worse. This was just part of the fight. She had no intention of backing down now. The movement she was leading was unlike anything the country had seen before. It wasn't just a call for justice. It was a call for a complete overhaul of the system. Maya wasn't just fighting for her seat at the table anymore. She was fighting for the dignity of every person who had been told they didn't belong. She was fighting to give them a voice, to give them power, to give them the opportunity to rewrite the rules. As the momentum built, Maya knew one thing for certain. They had underestimated her. The system that had tried to break her was now shaking under the weight of her movement. And they were terrified. Maya Collins had become the symbol of resistance, of change, and of the power of the people. She was no longer fighting for a position within the system. She was fighting to change the system, and she would not stop until it had been completely reshaped. The world would see that she was not just a force to be reckoned with. She was the future. And the future was coming for them all. Maya Collins stood at the front of a crowded auditorium, the echo of the restless murmurs fading as she prepared to speak. This was her moment. It wasn't just about the movement anymore. It wasn't about winning a seat on the bench, or about proving that she belonged in a system that never truly accepted her. No, this was something far bigger. It was the culmination of everything she had fought for, everything she had endured, the long nights, the sleepless days, the constant battle against a world that saw her as less than human. She had learned that true power didn't come from the approval of a broken system. It came from the people, and the people were with her now. The movement she had created was no longer a whisper. It was a roar. Her voice, calm but unwavering, filled the room. "It's been a long road," Maya began, her words carrying a weight that no one could ignore. A road paved with obstacles, with prejudice, and with the constant reminder that the world wasn't built for people like me. But I stand here today, not as a victim of that system, but as a challenger. And more importantly, I stand here as a woman who is not afraid to change the rules. The crowd was silent. Every eye was locked on her. The movement that had started as a spark was now a wildfire, spreading across the country, challenging the foundations of a broken legal system that had been built on racial injustice and inequality. For years, Maya had been told she didn't belong. She had been told that the world was too big, too unforgiving for someone like her to succeed. And yet, here she was, not just succeeding, but leading. Her campaign, once a solitary fight, had become a collective force. She had managed to unite a coalition of communities that had long been silenced, marginalized groups, women of color, the disenfranchised who had been ignored by those in power for far too long. They were no longer invisible. They had found their voice, and Maya was their megaphone. But as much as she had gained, she had also lost. The path she had chosen was not without sacrifice. She had sacrificed relationships, friendships, and her own sense of peace. The hate that had been directed at her had been relentless. The media campaigns against her had been vicious. The whisper campaigns, the subtle racist undertones in every piece of commentary. They had tried to break her, to force her into submission. One particularly brutal attack had come just weeks before the rally. A media outlet, one of the largest in the country, ran a segment accusing her of being too radical. The tone was clear. Maya wasn't just challenging the status quo. She was trying to destroy it. The reality is simple, the anchor said in the segment. Maya Collins is not someone who can be trusted with power. She is a symbol of anger, not reason. A symbol of chaos, not order. The very idea of someone like her holding a position of power undermines the stability of our society. Maya's stomach had turned when she first saw it. She knew what they were trying to do. They weren't debating her policies or her qualifications. They were attacking her as a person, as a black woman with the audacity to want something more than what society had given her. It wasn't about merit. It wasn't about fairness. It was about keeping people like her in their place. The system had always tried to keep her in the shadows, to dismiss her as too angry, too emotional, too unpredictable. They tried to silence her by framing her as an anomaly, a woman too upset to function within their structured, orderly world. But Maya had never been one to shrink from their gaze. She had learned early on that they would never accept her as an equal. And so, she had refused to play by their rules. When the segment aired, the backlash was swift. The hate mail poured in. The threats grew louder, and the supporters who had been with her from the beginning were tested. They saw the smear campaign for what it was, an attempt to break the movement. And yet, despite the venomous attacks, Maya stood tall. She refused to be defined by their hatred. Every insult, every racist comment, only solidified her resolve. As she spoke at the rally that day, her words echoed through the hall, the power of her voice cutting through the noise of the media frenzy that surrounded her. The system is not broken because of me. It's broken because of them. It's broken because it was designed to protect the interests of a few while pushing the rest of us aside. It's broken because it has never been about justice. It has always been about control, Maya declared, her gaze sweeping across the crowd. They are afraid of us. They are afraid of what we can accomplish when we come together. They are afraid because they know that change is inevitable. And no matter how hard they try to silence us, we will not be stopped. Her words reverberated in the hearts of everyone who had come to see her. The power of her message was undeniable. It was a call to arms, a declaration that no longer would they allow themselves to be subjected to a system that had failed them time and time again. But as much as the crowd cheered, Maya knew that the fight was far from over. The backlash against her was growing. She had already felt the sting of their attempts to discredit her, and she knew that as the movement grew, the attacks would only get worse. The legal community was particularly harsh. The old guard, the powerful judges and attorneys who had shaped the system for decades, were not pleased with her rise. They had spent their entire careers cementing their dominance, and now, here she was, threatening everything they had worked for. The whispers in legal circles were sharp and filled with contempt. "I don't think we should take her seriously," one judge had said to a colleague, his voice dripping with disdain. "She's a firebrand. She's not fit for the bench. She's too emotional. She's too angry." The same words were repeated over and over again. Maya was too angry. She wasn't rational enough. She didn't belong. But what they didn't realize was that Maya was exactly what the system needed. It was broken. The anger that they saw in her was not a flaw. It was a reflection of the frustration and pain that had been boiling beneath the surface for far too long. It was a reflection of a broken justice system that had consistently failed the most vulnerable, the most oppressed. The system was never built to include people like her. It was built to exclude them, to keep them out of positions of power, to ensure that the status quo was never threatened. But Maya had learned something important. You didn't have to play by their rules. You could make your own. But there was a cost to this defiance. As Maya's movement gained momentum, the stakes grew higher. The media scrutiny intensified. The hate mail escalated. And now, as the legal establishment began to feel the heat, the backlash from the political elite was swift and unforgiving. Maya's rise had become a threat not only to the judicial system, but to the very power structures that had kept them in control for generations. Her phone rang late one night. It was a private number. "Maya, you need to be careful," the voice on the other end said, low and cautious. "They're targeting you. The smear campaign is only the beginning. They're going to do everything they can to destroy you, and they won't stop until they've taken you down." Maya's heart raced as she listened, the weight of the warning settling over her like a dark cloud. She had known it wouldn't be easy. She had known there would be resistance. But this was different. This was bigger than anything she had faced before. But it didn't matter. Maya Collins wasn't afraid anymore. She knew what she had to do. She wasn't going to back down. She was going to fight harder than ever before. She would push forward, no matter how much they tried to tear her down. She would show them what real power looked like. They had underestimated her, and now they were going to regret it. The battle was just beginning. Maya had become a symbol of resistance, of strength, and of the fight for justice. She was more than a politician, more than a legal reformer. She was a force, an unstoppable force, that was shaking the very foundation of the system they had so carefully built. And she was just getting started. The reckoning was coming, and there was no turning back. The streets outside were quiet, eerily still in the early morning light. Maya sat in the dimly lit room, the walls lined with shelves of legal books and framed portraits of those who had come before her. The weight of history pressed down on her shoulders. She had fought for so long, had given everything she had to break through the walls that kept people like her out. And now, as she prepared for the final leg of this battle, she knew the stakes had never been higher. It wasn't just about her anymore. It wasn't just about winning a position, a seat, or a title. It was about changing the system itself, about standing in the face of those who had never once seen her as human and telling them they were wrong. Maya leaned forward, her fingers tracing the outline of a photo on her desk. It was an old picture, one from years ago, before everything had started to fall apart. She was young, full of hope, standing with her mother outside their modest home. The smile on her face was bright, innocent. It was a time before she had tasted the bitterness of rejection, before the world had shown her how deep the rot went. But she could still feel the pride in her mother's eyes as they both looked towards a future filled with possibilities. And then, it all came crashing down. Every injustice, every racial slur, every whispered judgment. It had all led to this moment. The endless struggles had only sharpened her resolve. Maya had walked into boardrooms where people like her weren't welcome. She had sat in classrooms where her voice wasn't heard. She had faced years of ridicule, microaggressions, and overt racism. But nothing had been as crushing as the day the system had made it clear that she was never meant to succeed. As she sat there, in the final moments before what would be her last chance to make her mark, the memories of everything she had been through resurfaced. She could hear the voices of the men who had humiliated her, the whispers in the halls, the condescending comments in meetings. "You're too angry, Maya. You'll never make it," they had said. They had written her off, convinced that their centuries-old system of power, privilege, and oppression would keep her in her place. But she hadn't stayed there. With each moment of degradation, she had risen. With each insult, she had burned hotter. She had become something they couldn't understand, something they were terrified of. A woman who would no longer be silent. A woman who refused to let them define her. The movement she had built had become an unstoppable force. From the grassroots to the courtroom, from the rallies to the streets, Maya had given people a voice. But as her influence grew, so did the hate directed at her. The media had tried to tear her down. The system had tried to keep her out. The political elite had tried to suppress her, calling her too emotional, too radical, but she wasn't done. Maya stood up from her desk and walked to the window, looking out at the city below. The sun had just begun to rise, casting a soft golden glow over the streets. The city, so familiar and so alien to her, seemed to pulse with the energy of possibility. She had always loved this city, its hustle, its drive, its promise. But now, it was a symbol of something greater. It was a battleground, a place where everything she had fought for would either be realized or erased. The day of the final hearing had come. This was her last chance. The people who had opposed her, who had mocked her, who had belittled her every step of the way, they would be watching. It wasn't just a trial for her. It was a trial for everything she represented. The tired, racist system she had been forced to endure for her entire life would either stand or fall in this moment. Maya had always known it would come to this. She had seen the whispers, the subtle attempts to undermine her at every turn. But it wasn't just the obvious racism that hurt. It was the quiet, insidious way that the world had tried to make her feel small. The way it had tried to make her believe that her very existence was an affront to the order they had worked so hard to maintain. The hearing was held in a large, imposing courtroom. The walls, steeped in the tradition of power, were a constant reminder of the weight of the system. As Maya entered the room, she could feel the eyes on her, the familiar gaze of scrutiny. She wasn't just a lawyer now. She was a symbol of resistance, of defiance, of everything the system had sought to destroy. As she took her seat at the table, she could see them, the men who had tried to push her back, the ones who had doubted her, the ones who had whispered in corners and called her too aggressive. They were seated across from her, their expressions cold and disdainful. She could see the subtle sneers on their faces, the way they had already decided that she didn't belong here. But she would not back down. The judge, a man who had always looked at her with a mixture of suspicion and condescension, cleared his throat. "Ms. Collins," he began, "you've made quite a name for yourself, but your recent actions, they've raised concerns. We've received complaints about your conduct. Your behavior, your rhetoric, has become increasingly confrontational. This isn't the demeanor of someone who should be entrusted with such power." The room fell into an uncomfortable silence. Maya could feel the sting of his words, the weight of their judgment. They had done everything they could to discredit her, to paint her as a dangerous, unfit candidate for the very thing she had spent her entire career fighting for. But it was too late. They couldn't erase her now. Maya stood up slowly, her heart pounding in her chest. She met the judge's eyes, her gaze unwavering. "If you are judging me based on my anger, then you are missing the point entirely," she said, her voice steady but filled with conviction. "This anger is not a flaw. It is the result of a system that has been broken for far too long. It is the anger of every person who has been ignored, every person who has been told they don't belong, the people who have been pushed aside, told their voices don't matter. I am angry, yes, but I am angry because I know what this system does to people like me, and I refuse to let it continue." She paused, her eyes scanning the room. The silence hung in the air, heavy and palpable. The people who had dismissed her, who had tried to control her, were now seeing the force she had become. "I am not here to apologize for who I am or for what I've had to fight for," she continued, her voice growing stronger. I am here because the system needs to change, and I will not stop until it does. The room was still. No one spoke. The words she had said, the weight of them, seemed to hang in the air like a challenge. Maya could feel the shift. The room had gone from dismissing her to acknowledging her power. The moment was no longer about her. It was about something much larger. It was about the people who had supported her, the people who had believed in her, the people who had risen alongside her. This wasn't just about one woman's fight for justice. It was about the fight for justice itself. And that fight, Maya knew, was one they could never win if they continued to play by the same broken rules. In the silence that followed, Maya took a deep breath and spoke one final time. You can't stop this movement. You can't silence our voices. We will keep fighting, and we will win. As she turned to leave the courtroom, she could feel the eyes of the room on her. But this time, they were different. There was no judgment, no derision. There was respect. Respect for the woman who had fought and would continue to fight against a system that had tried to break her. And as the door closed behind her, Maya knew that no matter what happened next, her fight was far from over. She had not just changed the system, she had shattered it, and the world would never be the same again. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this story. What do you think about Maya's journey and the challenges she faced? Have you ever experienced racism or unfair treatment in your own life? Your comments mean a lot to us, and we truly value each and every one of you who engages with us. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts. Your support helps us continue creating meaningful content. Have a wonderful day, and if you're listening all the way to the end, feel free to leave the phrase "Fighting for Change" in the comments so we know you're with us until the very end. Thank you.